So, one more story, and this one's a bit outside the usual wheelhouse, too. But it's a story that I think should remind one of the value of skepticism. And in that sense, perhaps it still is inside the wheelhouse of the show. But anyway, everyone's probably heard of the movie The Sound of Freedom by now. It stars Jim Caviezel, who you might remember from Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Caviezel played Jesus in that film, of course, and in The Sound of Freedom, which is supposedly based on true events, he plays Tim Ballard, I believe it is, who both in the movie, I believe, I haven't seen it yet to be fair, and in real life runs an organization called Operation Underground Railroad, or OUR, the aim of which is to combat human sex trafficking, especially the trafficking of children. And there are some people out there who have called some of Tim Ballard's claims or the methods of OUR into question, but what drew me to the story is the Adrenochrome angle. I'm a big fan of counterculture literature. I used to read a lot of beat literature like Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, etc., and then stuff like Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and in fact, the film version of that movie starring Johnny Depp is one of my all-time favorite films. And if you've ever seen it, you'll probably remember the adrenochrome scene. It's touted as this rare, super powerful drug that needs to be harvested from a human body. And in the book version, I believe it's the lawyer character who says, in quotes, "There's only one source for this stuff. The adrenaline glands from a living human body. It's no good if you get it out of a corpse." Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the book, came out in 1971, I believe, and a couple of years later, in 73, in his book Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 72, Thompson mentions adrenochrome again, saying in the footnotes, "It was sometime after midnight in a ratty hotel room, and my memory of the conversation is hazy due to massive ingestion of booze, fatback, and 40 cc's of adrenochrome." And another of my favorite books is Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. And I had completely forgotten about this, but apparently Huxley refers to adrenochrome in the book, admitting that he himself had never taken it, but stating that the effects are supposedly similar to mescaline intoxication. Now, I have to admit, I've seen the film version of A Clockwork Orange, but I've never read the book. But apparently, adrenochrome is referred to as drenchrome in it. And here's a quote. "They had no license for selling liquor, but there was no law yet against prodding some of the new veshes, I think it is, which they used to put in the old Moloko, so you could peat it with Velicet, or Synthamesk, or Drenchrome, or one or two other veshes." I'm probably butchering the slang, but you get the point. I have a close friend who did read the book version, and they were just talking about having to try to get used to all this made up slang as you're kind of slogging through the book. And slogging might be a poor choice of words. Apparently the book's quite good. But anyway, and the reason why I'm talking about adrenochrome in regard to Tim Ballard and the Sound of Freedom is because I had noticed a Jordan Peterson video in my YouTube feed, and it was an interview with Tim Ballard and Jim Caviezel, and I'm not even really sure why I clicked on it because I don't really consume a lot of Jordan Peterson content, that much anymore. But I think maybe I was just curious because he was interviewing a fairly big named actor, Jim Caviezel. And I think I was also just curious to see how Jim Caviezel would handle himself during the interview because supposedly he's kind of gone down the QAnon rabbit hole to some degree. QAnon, a movement which came out of the infamous internet cesspit known as 4chan, if I'm not mistaken. And speaking of QAnon, there's a related topic I've been wanting to cover, but I keep putting it off. I keep hearing these crazy stories about how some QAnon followers or believers think that JFK Jr., or in some versions, JFK himself, are going to return at an appointed time. And when I hear these stories, my mind automatically goes to the infancy of Christianity and beliefs about Jesus's imminent return. Every generation thinks theirs is going to be the one in which Christ returns, but been 2,000 years now, and everyone's still waiting. And I wondered, could something similar have happened that sparked Christianity? A charismatic leader dies, and then people start throwing the idea out there that he's coming back, and then these ideas or beliefs spread like a contagion, and you got yourself a religion. Maybe 2,000 years from now, if we don't destroy ourselves first, people will be standing behind pulpits talking about the imminent return of JFK and his son. The father and the son. Sounds like something you'd see in a Futurama episode if they haven't already done it. But anyway, in the interview that Jordan Peterson did with Jim Caviezel and Tim Ballard, Ballard brings up adrenochrome, and I think Caviezel has actually brought up adrenochrome before. And it's strange, Ballard embraces some QAnon beliefs, like adrenochrome and satanic ritual abuse, while simultaneously trying to distance himself from QAnon. But before we dig into the clips, I should state that adrenochrome is a real substance. Apparently, it can be derived by oxidizing adrenaline, epinephrine, in a lab. No need to harvest it from a body, as I understand. Apparently, it had been a topic of study decades ago because doctors thought that adrenochrome, may play a role in schizophrenia, and supposedly, as suggested by Huxley, it can induce mescaline-like hallucinations. And so I'll read a bit from this McGill University article, and it's by Joe Schwartz, I think it is, PhD, and this was published in 2022, so not that long ago, and it's under pseudoscience. Yeah, it's McGill's Office for Science and Society, separating sense from nonsense. And so it begins. There's only one source for this stuff, the adrenaline glands from a living human body. And that's the quote I already read. That bit of misinformation found in Hunter S. Thompson's 1971 psychedelic classic, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, likely planted the seed that grew into one of the most outlandish and repugnant of all conspiracy theories. That would be the ludicrous QAnon claim that Hollywood celebrities and quote-unquote liberal elite politicians are kidnapping children to harvest their blood. QAnon is a not-so-fringe, baseless theory that a government agent, Q, is a source of continuous information about the quote-unquote deep state or deep state secrets, such as the existence of a global cabal of P-word that I don't want to get me demonetized, who thirst for the blood of children. Why? The farcical QAnon rationale is that they are using the blood as a source of adrenochrome, a chemical that supposedly has psychedelic properties and also holds the promise of immortality. Now, I'm also going to play some clips that aren't related to the Peterson interview in a bit, and in one of them, there's a guy talking about how you can basically get adrenochrome from breaking open an EpiPen, an epinephrine pen. And I'm like, if adrenochrome could really make you immortal, we could all be, snapping open epinephrine pens and drinking that crap. I'm in no hurry to die. If I thought you could become immortal by slurping the contents of an EpiPen, sign me up. But I'll continue with this McGill article. How did Thompson come to involve adrenochrome in his story in the first place, describing it as, quote-unquote, making pure mescaline seem like ginger beer? Somewhere along the line, he likely came across the work of Canadian psychiatrists Abram Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, who in the 1950s had noted a similarity between the symptoms of schizophrenia and the effects of mescaline, a naturally occurring hallucinogen found in the peyote cactus. Mescaline is not produced by the body, but the two scientists wondered if some substance with a similar molecular structure is produced under some circumstance, possibly causing schizophrenia. Since adrenaline shares a basic molecular structure with mescaline, it was a candidate for involvement. It was clear that adrenaline itself, the famous fight or flight hormone that is present in everyone's bloodstream, could not be the culprit, but perhaps some error in its metabolism could produce a mind-altering substance. A literature search of the chemistry of adrenaline revealed that in the lab it can be oxidized to a compound called adrenochrome, with the chrome ending deriving from the Greek word for color, since adrenochrome has a dark violet hue. At this point, the psychiatrist, in somewhat of a foolhardy fashion, tested the effects of this chemical on themselves. Indeed, adrenochrome produced hallucinations. Maybe Hoffer and Osmond theorized adrenaline is also oxidized in the body to adrenochrome, and due to some faulty biochemistry, the adrenochrome builds up and triggers schizophrenia, since adrenaline is known to form in the body by the addition of a methyl group, a carbon atom with 3 hydrogens, to its precursor noradrenaline. Dr. Hoffer postulated that the B vitamin niacin, being a methyl acceptor, would stall this reaction. Furthermore, vitamin C, an antioxidant, might prevent adrenaline from being oxidized to adrenochrome. Thus was born the, in quotes, adrenochrome hypothesis of schizophrenia. Doctors Hoffer and Osmond reported successful treatment of schizophrenics with megadoses of niacin and vitamin C, but a number of follow-up studies by others failed to confirm any benefit. The adrenochrome hypothesis faded into the background, but the reputed hallucinogenic effect of adrenochrome probably stimulated Hunter Thompson to include the drug in his novel. Adrenochrome also made it into the 1998 movie version of the book, and then in 2017 starred in a totally forgettable film, Adrenochrome, in which a young American veteran confronts some psychos in California who are on a murderous spree to extract the psychedelic compound from their victims' adrenal glands. The stage was now set for QAnon's perverse fabricated tale that a P-word ring of Democratic politicians and Hollywood celebrities is engaged in satanic sacrifices, culminating in slurping the blood of massacred children. To make matters worse, this crackpot lunacy has anti-Semitic overtones. Accusations that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make matzah for Passover have a long appalling history. And that's true. In the Middle Ages, you had blood libel, you had all these lurid accusations against the already marginalized Jewish community in Europe. And there are those overtones within these crazy QAnon beliefs. And so, once again, adrenochrome is apparently a known substance that can be synthesized in a lab. You don't have to harvest it from a human body. And as I understand it, it is psychoactive, but it's not some super drug as described in Fear and Loathing. In fact, I believe Terry Gilliam, of Monty Python fame, was actually the director of the movie version of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He basically admits that the version of the substance that you find in his movie and in Hunter S. Thompson's writings is like a fictionalized exaggeration. Anyway, let's get to some clips. And so this first clip from the interview Caviezel and Ballard did with Jordan Peterson has Ballard mentioning satanic ritual abuse in passing.
And these are real cases where they've kidnapped women, as young as 13-year-olds and children, and they impregnate them, they rape them, and they make babies, and they take these babies and sell them for their organs, sell them for sex, sell them for satanic ritual abuse. Like it does sound crazy. That's why I film it. We film our operations so that we can show the world this is very real. It's really happening.
Now, I was a kid during the Satanic Panic era of the 1980s. And I think that's when you really started to hear the term satanic ritual abuse. And often you'd hear the term in relation to something called recovered memory. You'd have people going to psychiatrists or therapists who would kind of hypnotize them or put them under and then help them supposedly uncover these horrible memories from their childhood that were so traumatic that they buried. And people would come up with all these lurid supposed memories of having been sexually abused by satanic cults, even their own parents or family. And it ended up turning out that, for the most part, if not entirely, these cases were BS. And you had many innocent people, family members, parents, being accused of being Satanist or abusing children when they never had. And I'll just briefly read a bit from this article from the Psychiatric Times. And so it says, just 25 years ago, American psychiatry was infected by a psychic pandemic that originated outside the profession. In 1983, it broke out of a reservoir of religious, legal, psychotherapeutic, and mass media mixing bowls. And I should mention for clarity, this article is dated 2014. That's why it says only 25 years ago. But I'll continue. Children in U.S. daycare centers and adults in psychotherapy told two distinct versions of their malady. By 1988, some elite members of the American Psychiatric Association were making it worse. They had become its vectors. Then other elite psychiatrists stepped in to quarantine the profession. Eventually, just like the last wave of influenza pandemic after 1994, it ended as suddenly and incomprehensibly as it had started. As our medical schools and graduate programs fill with students who were born after 1989, we meet young mental health professionals in training who have no knowledge or living memory of the satanic ritual abuse moral panic of the 1980s and early 1990s. But perhaps they should. Cautionary tales may prevent the recurrence of pyrogenic cultural fantasies and the devastating clinical mistakes they inspire. But who should tell this tale? To those of us who are old enough to have been there, that era already seems like a curious relic of the past, bracketed in our memory palaces behind a door we are loath to open again. In the 1980s, thousands of patients insisted that they were recovering childhood memories of physical and sexual abuse during satanic cult rituals, and goodbye monetization. Anyway, in addition to the red or black robes of the abusers and other paraphernalia of devil worship familiar to any horror film devotee or devotee, these memories often included the ritual sacrificial murder of children, blood drinking, cannibalism, bestiality, and incest. Definitely goodbye monetization. Famous believers in SRA, satanic ritual abuse, ranged from Gloria Steinem to Pat Robertson. A prominent historian of religion has argued that, in quotes, the emergence of SRA motifs served as a kind of feminist and evangelical Christian pornography. And I'm laughing or chuckling because I've never heard a connection made before between satanic ritual abuse and feminism. But maybe there's some angle I'm overlooking. I was young at the time. And it continues. Clinicians who then believed in the factual basis of the claims, and there were many, have probably spent the last 30 years asking themselves, how could I have been so, fill in the blank? Or perhaps they are still saying to themselves, as authors of one book suggest in their title, mistakes were made, but not by me. And here's a little blurb from Wikipedia, and I know Wikipedia. During the 1980s and 1990s, a moral panic about alleged satanic ritual abuse occurred, mainly in parts of the English-speaking world. This was propagated by certain psychotherapists, social workers, Christian fundamentalists, and law enforcement officials. Some of the cases ended in prosecution and imprisonment. Many, but not all of those imprisoned have been released. And so it's scary looking back. It's kind of like the Salem witch trials minus the executions that I know of. And we might tend to look back at something like the Salem witch trials and think, oh, they were so primitive and superstitious, that could never happen again. But essentially, that's kind of what the Satanic Panic was, and that's in, recent or living memory. And a topic that I thought about dedicating an episode to, over the years, but I've just never gotten around to it, is theistic Satanism. As I often talk about on the show, when you hear about Satanism nowadays, the two biggest satanic organizations, arguably the biggest, or two of the most well known, are, of course, the Church of Satan, founded by the late Anton LaVey, and then there's the Salem, Massachusetts based Satanic Temple, which is essentially a secular humanist organization that engages in social activism, defending the separation of church and state, defending reproductive rights, that kind of thing. And neither organization believes in a literal devil. They're both essentially atheistic organizations. They view Satan as just a symbol of free thought, rebellion, that kind of thing. But, are there theistic Satanists out there somewhere out in the world somewhere? And I can remember back in my day, even when we had this whole Satanic Panic thing going on, and this hysteria about satanic ritual abuse, there were, when I was a young metalhead, there were stories about young kids who were really into heavy metal. And at the time, there was a lot of dark heavy metal that utilized satanic cover album art and sang about satanic subject matter, etc. Slayer, Venom, stuff like that. That's undeniable. And I think there were cases of kind of disaffected, misanthropic kids who fancied themselves devil worshippers, who maybe went out in the woods and killed animals, as debased and disgusting, etc., as it is to think about. And I believe there's even been relatively rare cases of disturbed or disaffected youths who are into really dark stuff and claim to have, worshipped or idolized the devil, killing people. Such as, I think there were 2 girls in Italy back around 2000 roughly who killed a nun. And then there was the famous case of that little group of kids who thought they were vampires who killed one of the kids' parents. I think that was back around 1996. I think the ringleader's name was Rod Ferrell. Very disturbing and depressing case. I remember back before I was really online, there used to be just true crime stuff always on A&E and channels like that. And I remember seeing a couple of documentaries about the case. And I don't know if that little vampire gang claimed to be Satanist or not. But yeah, there's been cases of young disaffected people claiming to worship the devil and killing animals, sometimes even people. And so in that sense, there are or have been technically theistic Satanists. But how widespread is theistic Satanism? Are there any big theistic Satanist organizations out there? Maybe. But once again, the whole thing about the Satanic Panic, the satanic ritual abuse, that ended up being an unsubstantiated, moral panic. But on a quick side note, because I mentioned Slayer, I was watching some interviews and videos about Slayer recently, and I've known this for a while. The guitarist Kerry King, I believe, is an atheist, or he doesn't really believe in God and has kind of a chip on his shoulder against religion, but he's not a Satanist, and neither is the singer Tom Araya, who I couldn't believe how kind of good-natured, almost jolly the guy is in interviews. And it turns out Tom Araya actually does believe in a higher power, and I believe he actually considers himself Catholic. So despite how dark they are and how dark and satanic looking the album art is and everything, they claim that was always kind of a thing they used to scare people, but apparently Slayer, not satanic. And it was also interesting to note, I was watching an interview with Tom Araya, and he was saying that prior to being asked to join Slayer, he actually didn't even know what the heck heavy metal was. And he preferred kind of old 60s rock bands like Cream and that kind of thing. And the band members had to introduce him to groups like Iron Maiden and heavy metal in general. And here's me complaining about time going by too quickly again, but the guys in Slayer are in their late 50s and 60s. I think Tom Araya is in his 60s now. And I mentioned Devo earlier. The guys in Devo are in their 70s. And yeah, so the 80s were like 40 years ago. That is so insane. So the distance between us and the 80s is now like the distance between people in the 80s and the 1940s. That just absolutely blows my mind. And in a sense, as someone who remembers the 80s, it was such like a colorful period. The music sounded so modern and innovative. It was like this super colorful neon time that just seemed to come out of a vacuum, you know? So thinking about it as being 40 years ago is so weird. But on a positive note, if you go on YouTube and look for live performances from Devo from 2022, 2023, they still sound as sharp as ever. They sound absolutely incredible, to the point, and hopefully I'm not exaggerating, where if you didn't have any video, you were just going by the audio, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Devo performance from the 80s and a Devo performance now, other than maybe the recording quality. They are just still on top of their game. They obviously look a lot older, but they're one of those bands that have not lost their chops over the years. They sound absolutely incredible. And I think they're doing their farewell tour this year. It may even have already started. Iggy Pop still plays live too, and I think he's like 76. Anyway, I'm getting way too sidetracked by my interest in music. Let's get back on track. Okay, so satanic ritual abuse. And yeah, so when I heard Tim Ballard talking about satanic ritual abuse, as someone who remembers the Satanic Panic and how much of a hoax the satanic ritual abuse scandal or hysteria ended up being, it definitely raised an eyebrow, you know? And so my take regarding Tim Ballard is, I think life isn't always cut and dry. It's not always black and white or, I think often the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't think that Tim Ballard is a con man. At the same time, I think he may be something of a loose cannon. I know some people, as I said before, kind of question some of his claims, some of his methods. I think his heart is probably in the right place. I think he really is committed to the cause of ending human trafficking. At least I hope so. It's a very noble goal and it's an important cause. But something does seem a little off to me. He seems kind of too quick to employ terms like satanic ritual abuse, which, that's a term you usually only hear in reference to, once again, the Satanic Panic hysteria, or too quick to latch on to QAnon or QAnon adjacent ideas, like the elites are harvesting adrenochrome from children, etc. And speaking of that, I'll play, I think this is the clip where he mentions adrenochrome.
Yeah, absolutely. We that's a lie in Wikipedia. We have absolutely in our FAQs for years have condemned the majority of what we see with conspiracy theories. So they like to attribute me to the QAnon movement. There may be some truths in there, but there's so many falsehoods on top of that. So our FAQs refute that immediately because it discredits the movement. In fact, I would go so far as to consider that maybe certain people who don't want this known are responsible for some of the conspiracy theories in order to discredit the movement. And they go too far. They go too far in their assessment of things. But yeah, we absolutely have disavowed what's generally coming out of QAnon.
So that's him distancing himself from QAnon. So maybe the adrenochrome clip is the next one.
I mean, I'm not sure what exactly they're talking about. They might be referring to the fact that there's something called adrenochrome where they're taking children's blood and devouring it and so forth. And I've explained my experience with that, and I just did in West Africa and other places. We've seen this in several parts of the continent of Africa, and it's very real. It's very real. This witch doctory. They take these children. They take their organs. They take their blood. They drink it. They take the genitalia of children and hang it over the rooftop of their businesses, thinking that the dark gods will bless them. These are real things. And so I might say something like that, and then they connect it to something that a QAnon person says about, a celebrity who must be doing this too, but there's no evidence to back that, and they make a false connection there. And so that's the only example I can think of.
Okay. And there was Jordan Peterson at the end. Okay, but yeah, so it seems like he might be, in fairness to him, like he might be a little confused, like he's associating the name or word adrenochrome with, I don't know, blood drinking or harvesting blood or whatever from children. But it sounds like he might not even know exactly, chemically speaking, what adrenochrome is. He's just associating the word with people trying to harvest something from children. And did he really witness what he's describing? Was he in Africa and he witnessed people harvesting blood and organs from children in order to gain some kind of power or whatever it is from it? I don't know. I mean, that's pretty wild. I mean, people all over the world do some brutal stuff, especially in third world areas, etc., where you have bands of guerrillas and people, just indulging their dark sides and doing all sorts of things to war captives, etc. We still have slavery all over the world, and slavery in Africa, where you have kind of warlords, etc., taking slaves, abusing them, selling them, committing all sorts of atrocities against them. So is it impossible that he witnessed people doing horrible things to children, maybe even killing children, and maybe even engaging in some kind of superstitious stuff like using body parts because they thought they could gain some kind of power or divine protection from it? I mean, all of that's possible, but just the way he's talking, it doesn't sound like the specific harvesting of adrenochrome was necessarily going on. If what he says is true, he may have witnessed people harvesting, as gruesome as it is, blood or parts from children, and he just said, oh, they're trying to get something, so it must be that adrenochrome I've heard about. And of course, there's also the possibility that there might be some exaggeration going on, on his part. I don't know. And none of this is me trying to disparage or poo-poo the movie, The Sound of Freedom. As I understand it, it's actually doing quite well. Interestingly enough, I think it was sitting on the shelf for years, and here it is. It finally got released, and it's become something of a hit. And I've read reviews, and it seems like even mainstream critics have been giving it positive to fair reviews. And I think it's kind of being put in the same genre of film as, say, those Liam Neeson Taken movies. And yeah, so from what I understand it's not some amateurish straight-to-video piece of garbage. It's actually a fairly competent film that even critics have received fairly well. I think it would be fair for someone to wonder, given how the man it's based on is throwing out terms like adrenochrome and satanic ritual abuse, it might be fair to wonder how much of it is actually based on true events. But either way, that doesn't change the fact that the movie is apparently surprisingly good, and a lot of people like it, once again, including critics. But I mentioned I had some other clips. There's a podcast I've been aware of for a long time, but I've never listened to it or watched it on YouTube, and I found it in my feed. And I think it's Pod Save America, and it's probably safe to say it's a left-leaning podcast. And they were talking about QAnon and adrenochrome. And the guest, I think, was someone who used to be right-wing, was kind of raised in a conservative household, and he now helps shine a light on some of this conspiratorial stuff. So I'll play some of those clips. Here's the first one.
Yeah, I'd love to. Sure. So, it is so sprawling and there's all these different factions and stuff. So it can be kind of hard to like boil it down. But the core beliefs are pretty simple. They think this nefarious cabal has run the world for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And now the cabal is made up of people in Hollywood, in banking, in the Democratic Party. I mean, John, I'm sure you're on the list as well.
Oh, yeah.
The whole gang. And that this cabal, why do they run the world, right? Well, because they want to drain children's blood to stay alive forever in satanic rituals. And so this kind of calls back to Pizzagate as well. And then the second part of QAnon is that the military recruited Donald Trump to run for president and basically said, we're sick of this cabal. Only Donald Trump can take them on. And that someday there's going to come a moment called the storm when Donald Trump is going to arrest all of his enemies. And if you're a QAnon believer, your enemies by extension, everyone from, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton to Tom Hanks and Oprah, and execute them at Guantanamo Bay. And then for everyone else, there's going to be a sort of utopia after that. So that's sort of the fundamentals of QAnon.
So that all makes a lot of sense. It's clear that they're onto us.
Yeah, and once again, as far as I'm aware, QAnon is a movement that literally arose out of 4chan, which is, as I was getting into earlier, this kind of online cesspool, this kind of message board or forum where people would go to kind of shitpost, as the kids like to say, and try to outdo each other by trying to post shocking and irreverent content, etc. So the fact that a movement that is supposed to be preoccupied with the safety and well-being of children arose out of that environment is kind of ironic and suspicious. And it's kind of funny because it starts out as a product of internet culture, and then you end up with elderly people walking around with big Qs on their shirts and carrying, picket signs with big Qs on. It's wacky. But I'll play the next clip.
I hadn't realized that part of the QAnon conspiracy has its roots in very old conspiracies like the blood libel. Can you talk about that and why? What do you think the connection is between some of these old conspiracies and the QAnon conspiracy today, and why do you think these anti-Semitic tropes tend to have such staying power and keep appearing throughout different parts of history?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. All these institutions I mentioned are also often very stereotypically Jewish ones. Banking, Hollywood, these things. So there is this root in this medieval blood libel when this idea that Jewish people, rabbis, were kidnapping Gentile children and using their blood in Passover rituals. And this would create these pogroms up until the 20th century where like thousands of people would be killed. And so this idea recurs in QAnon, where this idea that all these Democrats, that George Soros is drinking children's blood. I mean, it's a pretty clear echo. And in terms of why it comes back, I mean, I think often these conspiracy theories build on one another. QAnon people there's sort of this fundamental question in QAnon, like, why does this cabal do this stuff? And then, they said, well, it's because they're getting this blood. They need this blood to stay alive. And then they hearken back to some neo-Nazi writings or some Nazi writings. And so it all builds on it.
And it's true, as I was touching on earlier, there's centuries of anti-Jewish propaganda, lurid claims of, as they mentioned, Jews harvesting Gentile children for their blood, or Jews poisoning wells, etc., characterizing Jews as Christ killers. And that blows my mind. It's something I used to talk about a lot in the early days of the show. Sadly, there's even a lot of Christians who are anti-Semitic, when Christianity is essentially a Jewish religion. It's an offshoot of Judaism. It's kind of the daughter religion of Judaism. And Jesus, if there was a historical Jesus, I'm agnostic on the historicity of Christ. I can go either way. I could easily see there actually being a historical figure, Yeshua, who is this charismatic teacher or spiritual figure who ended up getting crucified by the Romans and a religion formed around him. Or I could also see him being kind of a mythic composite figure that arose later. Either way, but Jesus would have been Jewish. His apostles would have been Jewish. The crowds he preached to would have been Jewish. I believe it's thought that 3 out of the 4 gospel writers probably would have been Jewish, with the exception of Luke, who is considered or thought to be a Gentile traveling companion of Paul. Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, Jewish, So Christian anti-Semitism has never made a lot of sense to me. Yeah, if the story is true, the Pharisees, etc., the people who would have betrayed Jesus, according to the story, handed him over to the Romans, pushed for his execution. Yeah, they would have been Jewish, but the heroes of the story essentially would have been Jewish too. Jesus, like I said, the apostles, people we think favorably of, like Mary, the mother of Jesus, Joseph, another Joseph of Arimathea. Yeah, so it's very selective. Oh, we're going to hate the Jews because some Jews, if the story is real, are the ones who are at least partly responsible for Jesus' death, but we don't reserve the same kind of disdain for the Romans, who are the ones who actually nailed him to a cross. Christian anti-Semitism has never made sense to me. Never mind the fact all the biblical patriarchs, all the Old Testament figures that Christians revere, big surprise, Jewish. Anyway, next clip.
Not to get in too deep on the blood question, but I also hadn't realized that. So the reason that the cabal is drinking the kid's blood is because there's something called adrenochrome.
Yes.
And that's supposed to make you live forever. Is that the whole thing?
Yeah, and the origin story here is really, really bizarre, even by QAnon standards. So in the adrenochrome is a real thing. It comes from oxidizing adrenaline. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually like pretty easy to come across. You could take an EpiPen and open it up.
So you don't need to drink children's blood.
That's only additive. Yeah. It essentially has no medical purpose in the real world. But in the 60s, these counterculture writers, it sounds cool, right? It sounds like the ultimate drug. And so someone like Hunter S. Thompson wrote about it in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And in that book, there's a line where his lawyer says, you can only get this drug from a pedophile, and you drain it from a child's brain or something like that. And that then this becomes, for QAnon people, they're like, holy moly, this is real. And so that kind of builds on these other things. And so they believe that, essentially the only way to get adrenochrome, which is how celebrities stay looking so young. I mean, they don't understand like Botox, I guess. All this stuff is like lost in that. And so instead it's like,
come to LA, just check it out.
And so, during the pandemic, when these shows had to go, like talk shows had to, go from home or over Zoom, suddenly everyone's looking more tired. It's not that the makeup people aren't working. It's that the adrenochrome has been disrupted. So that's the origin of it. And, you'll see people like at these rallies and stuff, and they'll say, I'm not, don't drain me. Like I've seen kids with shirts that say like, I'm not pizza, meaning like, don't eat me for adrenochrome.
Oh my God.
And so there was the part where he says you can basically get adrenochrome from an EpiPen. And I'm not sure if he's saying you can take the epinephrine from an EpiPen and then somehow oxidize it into adrenochrome, or if once you open the EpiPen, it becomes oxidized. I don't know. I think I actually have a couple of EpiPens I've never used in my car. That would definitely get me banned if I did a little experiment on YouTube trying to convert epinephrine from an EpiPen into adrenochrome. But I used to get allergy shots, and I probably should still be getting them, but I fell out of the habit during the lockdown when everything was locked down or shut down, and I just never started up again. But even though I've never needed an EpiPen in my life, just as a precaution, they used to make you get one in order to get the shots. So I'm kind of tempted. Can I make my own adrenochrome? And should someone who's currently been wrestling with depression and anxiety be making homemade adrenochrome and taking it? I don't know. Probably not. Anyway, I've been going at this for a long time. I think I'm going to call this episode a wrap. As always, thank you everyone so much for listening. You guys know the drill. You can like the Facebook page, can follow the show on Twitter or X, even though I'm not on there much. You can check out the YouTube channel. Maybe you're doing that now. If you'd like to help the show out monetarily, you can go to patreon.com/theweekindoubt and help support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. All right, brothers and sisters, until next time.